When I was 16 years old, I lived in a small suburban neighborhood that was mostly quiet and unremarkable. Our house was modest, comfortable, and generally a place of safety and warmth. However, we lived right next to a house where seances were regularly held. This particular house belonged to a neighbor known for hosting these spiritual sessions, and it always had an air of mystery and unease around it. The house next door was old and slightly dilapidated, with ivy crawling up its brick walls and windows that seemed perpetually clouded. It stood in stark contrast to the other homes on our street, which were well kept and cheerful. The proximity to this house meant that I could often hear strange, muffled voices and occasional odd noises, especially on the evenings when they held their seances. Knowing what went on next door filled me with an eerie, unsettling feeling. The thought of spirits being summoned just a few feet away from my bedroom was enough to send chills down my spine. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of the unknown that lingered whenever I walked past their house. Even in the daylight, the place had an aura that made me uneasy, but at night, it was far worse. The atmosphere felt charged with an invisible energy, and I often found myself glancing nervously at their darkened windows, wondering what might be lurking behind them. One evening, I found myself home alone. My parents were out for the night, and my younger brother was at a friend's house. I was enjoying the rare solitude, lost in a book in the living room, when I heard a knock on the door. It was a firm, deliberate knock that echoed through the quiet house. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. My heart skipped a beat as I slowly got up, wondering who could be at the door so late. As I approached the door, my anxiety grew. The house was eerily silent, save for the distant murmur of the wind outside. I reached for the doorknob with trembling fingers and hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the empty front yard. I peered into the darkness, my eyes straining to see any sign of movement, but there was no one there. A shiver ran down my spine as I closed the door, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. I returned to the living room, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Minutes later, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I jumped, my book slipping from my hands. My pulse quickened as I walked back to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I flung the door open, my eyes darting around the porch, but once again, there was no one in sight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stepped outside, looking up and down the street. Everything was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I quickly retreated back inside, bolting the door behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone playing a cruel joke on me? Or was it something more sinister? The thought of the seances next door crept into my mind, and I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. I tried to focus on the book, but my eyes kept drifting to the door, my ears straining for any sound. The third knock shattered the fragile calm I had tried to build. It was deafening, echoing through the house like a thunderclap. I shot up from the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't want to open the door. I stood frozen in place, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open on its own. The air felt thick with tension, and a creeping dread began to suffocate me. Gathering every ounce of courage, I took a deep breath and approached the door for the third time. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. I flung the door open, my eyes wild with fear, but the porch was as empty as before. The silence was almost mocking, and the night seemed to press in on me from all sides. I slammed the door shut, my hands clammy and cold, and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The fear and confusion were overwhelming. I felt trapped in my own home, the safe haven now a place of terror. The knocking had stopped, but the dread it left behind lingered, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. After the third knock, my nerves were shot. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The fear that had settled in my bones was too intense to ignore. I made the decision to leave, to find safety somewhere else until my family returned. My heart was racing, and my hands shook as I rushed to my bedroom to grab a backpack. I flung open my closet, grabbing the essentials, my phone charger, a change of clothes, and my wallet. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the leaves outside, the hum of the refrigerator. The normally mundane noises now felt menacing, as if the house itself were alive and watching my every move. I shoved everything into my backpack, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. Just as I was zipping out my backpack, the door to my room slammed shut with a force that made me scream. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed through the house and left my ears ringing. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I spun around, staring at the door in utter disbelief. It had slammed shut on its own, as if some invisible force had pushed it closed. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as my mind raced. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. My hands were trembling uncontrollably as I reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt like it was locked from the outside, trapping me in my own bedroom. Panic surged through me, and I began to pound on the door, shouting for help even though I knew no one could hear me. The realization that I was alone, completely alone, with whatever had caused the door to slam shut, was almost too much to bear. I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I sank to the floor, my back against the door, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to gather my wits and tried the door again. This time, it opened easily, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled back into the hallway, my legs weak and shaky. The house seemed even more sinister now, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I clutched my backpack to my chest and made my way to the front door, determined to get out of the house before anything else could happen. As I made my way down the hallway, my steps quickened with desperation. I was just a few feet from the front door when a sudden, bone-chilling cold swept through the air. It was a cold so unnatural, so intense, that it made my breath fog up in front of me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and a shiver ran down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Then, it happened. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. There, emerging from the wall of my bedroom, was a man. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark suit that looked out of place, like something from another era. His features were sharp and unnervingly clear despite the dim light. He had hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through me, and a pallor to his skin that suggested he hadn't seen the light of day in years. The man moved with an eerie, deliberate slowness, as if he were floating rather than walking. His suit was immaculate, but there was something off about him, something profoundly wrong. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted with fear, and my body was paralyzed. The apparition continued to move towards me, gliding through the air with a spectral grace. As he drew nearer, the cold intensified, and I felt my body start to shake uncontrollably. The overwhelming sense of dread was suffocating, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. My vision began to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges of my sight. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even as I felt my knees buckle beneath me. The fear was all-consuming, a primal terror that left me completely helpless. I tried to back away, but my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. The last thing I saw before the darkness took over was the man's hollow, unblinking stare fixed on me, his face a mask of unearthly calm. As I lost consciousness, a desperate thought flitted through my mind. What if I never woke up? The fear was so intense, so visceral, that it felt like it was suffocating me even as I fell into the blackness. My last coherent thought was a silent plea for help, a hope that somehow, someone would come to my rescue before it was too late. The next morning, I woke up feeling disoriented and drained, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. My room felt unusually cold, and a sense of dread hung in the air. I tried to shake it off as I got ready for the day, but the memory of the man in the suit haunted my every thought. Later that day, there was a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of anxiety, but it was just my neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez. She looked visibly upset, her face pale and her eyes filled with concern. She apologized for disturbing me, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry," she began, wringing her hands nervously. "Yesterday, during our seance, something went terribly wrong. We were trying to contact the father of one of our members, but we couldn't reach him. Instead, the spirit seems to have wandered off." I felt a chill run down my spine as she continued. "I think it came to your house. We tried everything to bring it back, but it was too late. I am so sorry for any fear or harm it may have caused you." Her words confirmed my worst fears. The apparition I had seen was not just a figment of my imagination, it was real, a restless spirit accidentally unleashed from the seance next door. I felt a mix of anger and helplessness wash over me. How could they be so careless? How could they let something like this happen? Mrs. Ramirez's apology was sincere, but it did little to ease my mind. The damage was done. The sense of security I once felt in my home was shattered, replaced by an overwhelming fear of the unknown. I couldn't shake the image of the man in the suit from my mind, and every creak and shadow in the house seemed to take on a sinister new meaning. In the months that followed, I found it increasingly difficult to stay in the house alone. The eerie feeling that something was watching me never truly went away. Even with my family around, I couldn't escape the sense of unease that had settled over our home. Sleep became elusive, and I often found myself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, expecting to see that ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. A year later, I finally convinced my family to move. The house next door continued to host seances, and I couldn't bear the thought of another incident like the one I had experienced. We packed up our lives and left, seeking a fresh start in a new place, away from the haunting memories. But even now, the fear lingers. I find myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, and feeling a constant, nagging anxiety that something is always just out of sight. The experience left a deep scar on my psyche, shaking my belief in the safety of my own home and instilling a lasting wariness of the paranormal. I can only hope that the spirit has found peace, and that one day, I too will be able to leave the terror of that night behind me.